morning, fellow humanists. My name is Todd Kimball. It is an honor to be your MC this morning. A reminder that humanism is a rational philosophy informed by science, inspired by art, and motivated by compassion. It advocates the extension of participatory democracy and the expansion of an open society standing for human rights and social justice. Our reader joins us directly from the Friendly House this morning, the lovely and talented Ann Henderson.
I'm reading a poem by Julia Vinograd, the poet. She's kind of a poet laureate of, I think it's Brooklyn, but anyway, it's about the World Trade Center. It is called the World Trade Center. I am an old woman in a black dress, kneeling in the ruins, clutching my shoulders, teeth clenched and lips drawn back in a snarl, rocking back and forth in grief and rage. I need to tear out my enemy's throat, for the taste of his blood is better than strawberries. I am kneeling in the ruins of Byzantium. I am kneeling in the ruins of New York. I am saying the names of my dead children over and over as if they were silver bullets to shoot at God's smile. But I want to kill my enemy's children more than I want my own children back. My face is twisted and strong. People in uniforms want me to stand up and get out of their way. I ignore them. The sky's a pillar of smoke above me. There's a pillar of fire raging inside me. I clench my shaking old hands into fists. I need to squeeze my enemy's throat more than I need to hold my lover in the sweet and warm. His body's in front of me, squashed in a bloody pulp with fallen metal. Somebody takes our picture. I am kneeling in the ruins of Jerusalem. I am kneeling in the ruins of Ireland. I am kneeling in the ruins of New York. I am kneeling in the ruins of Stonehenge that was a city once. This was a world once, and I was human once, but I've forgotten it. I walk on bloody feet through war. Dying soldiers kneel to me, and I smile.
Thank you, Ann, for a raw and powerful reading this morning. 9/11 marks one of the most traumatic events of modern U.S. history, yet its occurrence and aftermath must be placed in context shaped by policy elites, social movements, and global developments. Our presentation this morning will offer thoughts on getting past the political and social divisiveness that has accompanied the series of crises followed by 9/11, or that followed 9/11 rather. Dr. David A. Horowitz, a native of the Bronx, graduated from Antioch College and received a history PhD from the University of Minnesota. He has taught U.S. cultural and 20th century history at Portland State since 1968, where he won the Millar Prize for Outstanding Faculty Achievements. Professor Horowitz is a prolific author. His books include Beyond Left and Right and The People's Voice, a populist cultural history of modern America. Let's have a warm yet muted welcome from our Zoom audience and a rousing ovation from our Friendly House crowd for Dr. David A. Horowitz.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm really honored that you've all asked me to share my thoughts on this central theme of recent American life. 9/11, the most traumatic event of U.S. history, evokes ghosts of the past while continuing to shape the national psyche. Exploring its legacy offers valuable insight into the law of unintended consequences, the rule of fear in public life, and the pangs of modernity. The lessons of tragedy, a recent work by national security analysts Hal Brands and Charles Adel, suggests that policymakers learn more from mistakes than past triumphs. In a post-revisionist account of the early Cold War, The authors explain how American leaders of that period sought to discourage a repeat of the nationalist and authoritarian military regimes held responsible for Pearl Harbor and the devastation of World War II, which took the lives of 70 million human beings on this planet. Fearing that the spread of Soviet communism represented such a threat, they cooperated with Western allies by replacing isolationist mindsets with a program of liberal internationalism. This entailed efforts to enhance human rights, the rule of law, democratic governance, and collective defense through the United Nations Charter and NATO. They also acted to stabilize capitalist economies through free trade, stable currencies, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the Marshall Plan. The thinking was that the economic devastation of the 1930s depression had brought about the authoritarian militarist dictatorships that led the world into war after 1939. These internationalist policies barely survived the communist takeovers of Czechoslovakia and China and the Soviet Union's testing of an atomic bomb. In response, conservative nationalists and anti-communists at home, ultimately led by Wisconsin Republican Senator Joe McCarthy, mounted voracious attacks on President Harry Truman for losing the Cold War. Once Soviet ally North Korea invaded the South, Truman agreed to a United Nations police force to repel the aggressors back to the 38th parallel. Under political pressure to take the opportunity to liquidate a communist regime, however, the president permitted General Douglas MacArthur to invade the North. This precipitated Chinese intervention and a deadly stalemate that accounted for 80% of America's 40,000 casualties in the Korean War. Seeking to strengthen France's role as an anti-communist ally in Europe, Truman and President Dwight D. Eisenhower assisted the French effort to squash an anti-colonial insurrection in Indochina. After Democrat John Kennedy dispatched special forces advisors to now the quasi-independent nation of South Vietnam, Lyndon Johnson followed Cold War strategy by escalating the commitment with ground troops and a massive air war. By 1968, over 500,000 US military personnel were fighting communist Vietnamese guerrillas and their supporters in Hanoi. At home, conservative populists, Ronald Reagan, George Wallace, and Richard Nixon, blamed the stalemate in Vietnam and the disorder linked to Black liberation struggles and anti-war activism on liberal cosmopolitans in Washington. Failing to ensure the great power settlement that he had promised in his 1968 presidential campaign, Nixon delayed signing a Vietnam peace treaty for 5 years, leading to America's worst social disarray since the Civil War. Unable to disengage from the war that he knew was unwinnable without offending his base, Nixon demonized and harassed anti-war protesters. This ultimately led to the series of illegal Watergate measures against all opponents, an exercise of, quote, power unfettered by law, as one historian puts it, that ended with the first presidential resignation in US history. By the time film clips showed Vietnamese dependents clinging to helicopter rudders as US officials evacuated Saigon during the presidency of Gerald Ford in 1975, Over 55,000 Americans in uniform had lost their lives in the struggle. President Jimmy Carter hoped to substitute diplomacy and humanitarian aid for military strength. When Iranian students captured 66 hostages from the US Embassy in Tehran, and the revolutionary Islamist regime held them for over a year, however, Carter struggled to respond. Ronald Reagan won the 1980 presidential election by promising to win the Cold War and return to the moral and military virtues associated with World War II. Reagan's campaign was helped by the hostage stalemate, by the Soviet invasion of its client state, Afghanistan, and by an energy and inflation crisis at home. Despite Reagan's promises of returning to the virtues of the US military effort in World War II, foreign entanglements blindsided his presidency as well. Not aware that anti-Soviet rebels in Afghanistan opposed all forms of Western modernity, not just communism, Reagan used the CIA to arm the Islamic insurgency. When the president dispatched the Marines to act as a peacekeeping force during the Lebanese civil war between Orthodox Christians and Muslims, a Lebanese militia affiliated with Iran bombed the US Embassy and a Marine base in Beirut, killing over 500 Americans. With terrorist kidnappings of US citizens continuing, including the torture and murder of CIA station chief in Lebanon, Reagan tacitly approved an illegal arms for hostage deal with Iran through intermediaries, leading to congressional hearings and even talk of impeachment. At the same time, Reagan's agreement with reformed Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, limiting the deployment of nuclear missiles in Europe, destroyed the threat of Western encirclement, precipitating the collapse of the Soviet Empire, and ultimately the end of the Cold War in 1991. President George H.W. Bush benefited from the thaw in international relations to proclaim a new world order in which the rule of law and recognition of national borders would supplant what he called the dictate of the jungle. Bush and Secretary of State James Baker orchestrated the participation of 500,000 American troops in a UN-sanctioned 27-nation coalition, including Saudi Arabia, Syria, and Kuwait, to reverse the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq dictator Saddam Hussein, intent on avoiding another Vietnam. The military adopted a doctrine of overwhelming force with a clear exit strategy. Beyond that, 84% of the war's costs were borne by the Saudis, Kuwait, and oil consumers Japan and Germany. A deference to Arab allies and fearing civilian casualties, moreover, Bush agreed to call off a march on Baghdad and accepted UN resolutions for monitoring Iraq's nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. Instead of war, President Bill Clinton authorized missile attacks to enforce an American-British no-fly zone in Iraq and supported a UN oil for food program. Yet he attracted conservative criticism. After forces loyal to a local warlord murdered 18 US soldiers deployed in the UN mission to deliver food relief during the Somalian Civil War. The bombing of US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, blamed on Al-Qaeda, an Islamist terrorist network headed by Saudi Arabia's Osama bin Laden, and an unanswered al-Qaeda attack on an American battleship off the coast of Yemen that killed 17 American sailors further damaged the administration. Bogged down by domestic policy gridlock and declining public faith in government after 1994, Clinton faced a special prosecutor's investigation into his financial dealings during his Arkansas governorship. The inquiry went nowhere, but led to Clinton's impeachment by the Republican-dominated House of Representatives in connection with a sexual affair with a White House intern. The Senate fell far short of a conviction, but Republican George W. Bush, a born-again Christian evangelical, benefited from the moral ambiguity of Clinton's personal behavior, enabled by a controversial 5-4 Supreme Court decision to halt a Florida recount over ballot irregularities in the 2000 presidential election. Bush squeezed out a narrow electoral college victory despite losing the national popular vote. The new vice president, Dick Cheney, was leader of the Vulcans in the national security bureaucracy, intent on reversing Clinton's cuts in defense spending. In a replay of the bipolar Cold War, National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice focused on updating missile defense system, failing to appreciate failing to appreciate the threat posed by rogue and stateless global terror groups such as Al-Qaeda. During the summer of 2001, the administration ignored reports from counterterrorism advisor Richard Clarke that bin Laden was preparing, quote, an attack, end quote, on the United States. An FBI agent's warning that an Arab national in Minnesota was learning to navigate airplanes with no interest in landing them got lost in the traffic. Later analyses pointed to a lack of coordination between the CIA and FBI in, quote, connecting the dots. On September 11th, 19 Islamic extremists affiliated with Al-Qaeda, 15 of them Saudis, used box cutters to take over 4 US airliners, forcing 2 into the Twin Towers of New York's World Trade Center and 1 into the Pentagon. A 4th plane, headed for the Capitol, crashed into a Western Pennsylvania field with no survivors after the passengers stormed the cockpit to divert it from targeting the nation's symbol of democracy. Nearly 3,000 people died in the most lethal attack on US territory in its history. US intelligence had little understanding of a brand of terrorism rooted in a fundamentalist 18th century Muslim sect hostile to the Enlightenment. Al-Qaeda itself emerged after Islamic guerrillas received weapons from the Reagan administration to oust the Soviet Union from Afghanistan. The movement played upon Arab grievances over civilian casualties from the Persian Gulf War, the alleged presence of American troops in Saudi Arabia, and US support for Israel against the Palestinians. Yet Al-Qaeda's main strength rested on calls for purity, personal duty, and solidarity, in contrast to the perceived decadence of global consumerism. Recruiting educated young migrants to the West in cyberspace sanctuaries, it sought to unite the world's 1.36 billion Muslims in a jihad against non-believer nation states through assaults on civilian life. 9/11 was its prime recruiting poster. As an act of terror, the attack was designed to convince Americans that their government was unable to protect them. Bush responded by emphasizing that the enemy was terrorism, not an ideology, not a religion, not a nationality. Bonding with firefighters and first responders, the president vowed to direct every resource to the disruption of the global terror network. When several hate attacks on Muslims ensued, Bush visited a mosque to plead for national unity without victimizing innocent scapegoats. As an act, the president's first official response, nevertheless, was the Patriot Act. The law permitted the government to retain foreign nationals on visa violations or minor charges and to monitor telephone and library records, as well as email contacts, even those with US citizens. This led to the deportation of thousands of foreign-born targets who were suspected of ties to terrorist organizations. Although critics objected to the law's seeming violation of civil liberties, the administration defended it as a necessary defense against further attacks, depicted as an essential task of government. Anxious to ensure safety, the Democrats in Congress pushed for the creation of an Office of Homeland Security, a preventative agency to coordinate intelligence on domestic threats, create a terror alert system, and manage airport security. The law expanded the enforcement duties of the FBI and Justice Department to counter intelligence. Although NATO invoked the only collective security alert in its history, and most of the world was extremely sympathetic to the victimization of the United States, Bush viewed 9/11 as a military matter for the United States alone. He noted that the Islamist Taliban government that succeeded the Soviets had welcomed bin Laden's base camps into the country and was still protecting them. With help from Afghan warlords and Pakistani troops, the campaign to overthrow the regime proceeded with bombing and counterinsurgency efforts by the CIA, Special Forces, and the Marines. The Taliban fell within weeks. In the process, 600 of its fighters were detained as stateless enemy combatants at the US naval base at Guantanamo, Cuba. Their incarceration came under the authority of dubious White House legal memos that sanctioned murder, torture, or indefinite detention for defenders tried in US military courts who supposedly were not subject to Geneva Convention protections for prisoners of war. By now, bin Laden was hiding in the mountains between Afghanistan and Pakistan, possibly aided by military forces from both nations. At this point, Vice President Cheney and the Defense Department Vulcans renewed an interest in Iraq. Invoking American exceptionalism, neoconservative defense hawks in the Republican Party viewed the breakup of the Soviet Empire as the result of US armed power and moral will. The erosion of military and executive power under Clinton, they believed, pointed to the loss of America's role as a great power and guarantor of world order. They now argued that the potential spread of weapons of mass destruction made this even more dangerous, requiring unilateral preemptive military strikes if necessary. Accordingly, President Bush's 2002 State of the Union message described the rogue nations of North Korea, Iran, and Iraq as an axis of evil, capable of delivering chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons to terrorist groups. Bush later warned that, quote, if we wait for threats to fully materialize, we will have waited too long. In June, the administration demanded that Saddam Hussein account for or destroy his WMDs. when Dick Cheney insisted that the Iraqi leader had had a role in 9/11, over 70% of Americans said they agreed. Historian David Potter has suggested in another context that people don't mind being lied to if it makes them feel safer. Whatever the case, the administration charged that Saddam was hiding WMDs that could be turned over to terrorist groups. We cannot wait for the final proof, the smoking gun that could come in the form of a mushroom cloud, Bush warned. As the midterm elections approached in 2002, Bush political consultant Karl Rove pressed the president to marginalize the Democrats by asking for congressional authority to protect the national interest with military action if diplomacy with Iraq failed. The resolution passed the Senate by a substantial margin, with support from potential presidential candidates Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, John Kerry, and those who accepted the argument that the threat of force would give American diplomats a stronger hand in dealing with Saddam. Their position was strengthened by UN Resolution 1441, which declared Iraq in material breach of its obligations to cooperate with weapons inspectors, who had left the country in frustration in 1998. The UN warned that Iraq faced, quote, serious consequences for non-compliance. Tens of thousands of anti-war protesters were soon marching in the streets of Europe and North America, including 10,000 in Portland. Rather than engaging the public on whether armed force would make the world and America safer, however, demonstrators seemed more inclined to venting moral outrage in opposition to any war that involved the United States. This had the danger of clouding the message when there were concrete arguments for opposing the war. In a twist to the story, Saddam invited the inspectors back and cooperated with on-site monitoring, but he did avoid documentation on the state of his weapons program and research. Bush seized upon this ambivalence in 2003 in his State of the Union, when he cited reports already discredited by the CIA that Iraq had attempted to buy uranium and aluminum tubes from Niger to be used in nuclear weapons production. Secretary of State Colin Powell then delivered a UN speech that charged Iraq with a cover-up by storing WMDs in portable labs. Powell asked for a deadline for Iraqi disarmament. Yet Security Council permanent members, France, China, and Russia, and allies like Germany, wanted more time for inspections and were skeptical of preemptive war. The impasse prompted Bush to lead a coalition of the willing, as he called it, a deployment of 300,000 troops by Britain and the US to usher in regime change and, quote, disarm Iraq and free its people. Like Bill Clinton, Bush sought to restructure the Middle East by encouraging democratic and market-oriented societies as a replacement for ideological dictatorships hostile to Western values that might be seeking WMDs. Yet by following a military path, the administration faced the law of unintended consequences and the risk of overplaying its hand. In May, the president's appearance in a flak jacket on a US battleship under a mission accomplished banner hid fatal flaws in an operation that ultimately would cost the lives of nearly 5,000 US military personnel and leave 40,000 wounded. The consequences of the Iraq occupation included looting and disorder following the disbanding of the country's armed forces and Ba'ath Party, the resulting exodus of 4 million refugees, US reliance on untrained contractors and multiple deployments of National Guardsmen to compensate for an inadequate military force, the torture and humiliation of Iraqi prisoners in response to an emerging insurgency, and the appearance of a post-war terror group, ISIL, drawn from Saddam loyalists, Iraqi nationalists, and sectarian militias. In September 2005, a few weeks after the Bush administration mishandled the response to Category 5 Hurricane Katrina on the Gulf Coast, 100,000 anti-war protesters marched in Washington, D.C. 2/3 of a poll of Americans now contended that the Iraq War had not been necessary, and the appearance of a post-war terror group made that seem even more problematic. Former counterterrorism advisor Richard Clarke produced some conclusions that were even more startling than that poll of Americans. One, CIA analysts had failed to recognize the significance of WMD data and engaged in groupthink about unproven allegations by cherry-picking intelligence, disregarding negative assessments of Iraq's WMD capacity, or actually engaging in duplicitous manipulations of information. Two, and I think this is the killer, the Bush administration's own weapons inspector subsequently reported that Saddam had hidden the fact that the UN had destroyed his WMD stockpiles at the end of the Persian Gulf War. He feared that public disclosure of that would leave him open to attacks by either the United States or his arch enemy, Iran. So he did lie about WMDs. He lied by implying he still had them when he didn't. Three, the invasion of Iraq played into the hands of Al-Qaeda, which based its appeal on a warning that the US was out to occupy Muslim nations, which is exactly what the United States was doing. A prediction validated by evidence of American torture and the failure to find WMD. And finally, the dismantling of the Sunni regime and the installation of a revenge-minded Shiite government furthered sectarian conflict in Iraq and allowed Iraq to become, yes, an Iranian client state. Saddam Hussein was tracked down by the American military and executed by the Shiite government in 2006. The US combat mission in Iraq ended 5 years later, although a complete withdrawal did not occur until 2021. A US Naval Special Forces team killed bin Laden in Pakistan in 2012. Only weeks ago, an American drone in Afghanistan took out his successor, Ayman al-Zawahiri. Yet the Taliban had resumed power by then, complicating a chaotic American departure from Kabul that brought back memories of Saigon in 1975. Altogether, the two post-9/11 wars killed 7,000 American troops and wounded 52,000. Another 30,000 veterans have died from suicide in the years since 2003. With little to show for the effort, much of the public has lost faith in so-called endless wars. Blinded by crises at home and abroad, from the energy shortages, inflation, economic depression, and Iranian hostage takeover of the Carter years, to continuing terrorism against US allies and overseas interests in the 1980s, to the financial meltdown after 2007, to a global pandemic that has killed over 1 million Americans since 2020, the people of the United States have seen much of their fate shaped by remote and sometimes unseen forces. 9/11 and the wars that followed reaffirmed the nation's vulnerability to unanticipated and distant events, validating a syndrome of fearful responses. In an age of unsubstantiated social media discourse, it became easy to turn suspicion about foreign actors, particularly Muslims and immigrants, toward a wariness of hidden elites at home. Divisions of this sort helped to shape the 2016 presidential election between Democrat Hillary Clinton and Republican Donald Trump. The former real estate tycoon and TV personality cultivated a following with evocations of ethnocentric and racial exclusivity, coupled with denunciation of cosmopolitan elites. At the same time, his supporters rallied around a mix of economic issues. They included rural Americans and working people in manufacturing and extractive industries who had lost confidence in the globalism of governing elites. Stung by deindustrialization and outsourcing, these voters relished Trump's attacks on international trade deals and liberal immigration policies. Their views overlapped with small business and corporate Republicans looking for tax reductions and less government regulation. Some 60% of the candidates' white voters without college degrees in 2016 fell in the top half of national income. Russian operatives supporting Donald Trump exploited these grievances by spreading disinformation and creating fictitious identities on online sites. These efforts sought to widen racial and ethnic divides and demonize centrists like Clinton as incapable of responding to the country's problems. The strategy seemed to work. When Green Party candidate Jill Stein amassed more votes than Trump's slight margins over Clinton in the key battlegrounds of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. When tied to lower African American turnout, the difference handed the Republicans their second electoral college win since 2000, despite losing the national popular vote. Yale political scientist Timothy Snyder has explained that Trump embodied both past and present global authoritarian tropes by depicting history as the struggle of powerful groups to dominate lesser people. Since raw emotions are preferable to reason and empirical fact in bonding followers, truth can be shared exclusively between the leader and, quote, the real people. Institutions, laws, the courts, the press, and rigged elections serve as corrupt barriers between a charismatic icon and the folk. The meaning of politics is not in policy, and certainly not in policies benefiting the base, but in expressions of emotional outrage toward perceived enemies, such as immigrants, Islamists, or liberals. The logic of what Timothy Snyder calls strategic relativism allows followers to assume that they are winning because their opponents seem to be losing, even if supporters don't accept the literal truth of all rhetorical outbursts. The pleasure of having someone articulate them may be irresistible. Beyond ethnic and racial exclusivity, cultural issues have played a huge role for Make America Great Again voters. This includes Christian evangelicals and other social conservatives seeking Supreme Court appointments to reassert traditional morality over abortion, religious freedom, and sexual decorum. Like many Trump supporters, these Americans view themselves as under siege by a cosmopolitan establishment of urbane, college-educated, woke elites who attack their values and are not true patriots. MAGA followers particularly object to the idea that identity politics is legitimate for everyone, but the European Americans or whites that multiculturalists disparage as racist. As subsequent attacks on critical race theory suggest, their grievances center on, quote, virtue signaling know-it-alls who blame the country's problems on generic categories such as whiteness or masculinity. Once elected, Trump revived the nationalism of the pre-Pearl Harbor America First movement. Catering to his base, who rejected anything associated with Barack Obama or previous presidents, he mocked the effectiveness of democratic governments and paid homage to authoritarians such as Vladimir Putin at the expense of traditional allies. Accordingly, Trump questioned the survival of NATO and cut off US participation in global trade, disarmament, and environmental treaties, referring to his generals, his cabinet, and recently, his White House national security documents. He personalized government and eroded the independence of the state, justice, and interior departments, as well as the Environmental Protection Agency, the Pentagon, the FBI, and intelligence community. Surviving 2 House impeachments for abuse of power and obstruction of justice, Trump played upon the base's desire for respect and incorporated an us against the world mentality by insisting that attacks on him were only designed to denigrate them. Donald Trump's spread of the big lie over Joe Biden's stolen presidential election, stolen in quotes, in 2020, and the subsequent assault on the Capitol led by Trump-aligned extremist militia, have solidified his role as a cult leader. Perhaps 25 to 30% of the electorate now seeks to impose strict social morality codes on adversaries, deny the protection of law for those they despise, and purge the public arena of ideas that threaten them. Some 40% of Republicans have told pollsters that it may be necessary to use force at home to protect, quote, America. Several Republican state legislatures have already acted to curtail the voting rights of those they do not see as real Americans. Some intend to establish state reviews of alleged fraud in the 2024 presidential election if the party faces defeat. In response, a delegation of professional historians has warned President Biden that the nation is under siege by internal enemies who no longer believe in the survival of democracy, a theme Biden has adopted in several recent addresses. Beyond judicial review, grounds for optimism, however, may rest with an estimated 40% of the electorate in the political center. These transactional voters, as I call them, including many women and suburbanites, may be open to alliances with those who do not directly threaten their values or interests. If so, they can provide a path, I believe, to transforming American politics and saving democracy through what Biden calls a coalition of goodwill. Translated to today, Theodore Roosevelt used to urge activists of the early 20th century to face life as it was, not as they thought it ought to be, and proceed from there to make it better. Translated today, when 2/3 of American adults lack a 4-year college degree, the lesson is that boutique appeals to an echo chamber of educated cosmopolitans risk the danger of what the Tufts scholar Etan Hirsch calls political hobbyism, where politics simply becomes another entertainment game. Coalitions, in contrast, Allow participants to find common grounds, even when they disagree on some issues. This means framing goals within the sensibilities and concerns of a broad band of the public. Democracy requires compromises. President Obama told Howard University students in 2016, even when you are 100% right. If you assume the mantle of moral purity, he warned, you're not going to get what you want, and most likely will retreat into cynicism and inaction, fodder for your adversary. I take better every time, the former president said, he told his staff, because you consolidate your goals and your gains, and then you move on to the next fight from a stronger position. Framing proposals that don't or insult potential partners is an important ingredient of successful politics. It's not what we say, but what the listener understands. The key axiom of communications theory. It's not what we say, but what the listener hears or understands. Obama appreciated this when he told the 2020 Democratic National Convention that, quote, yes, Black lives matter, no more, no less. A perfect summation of what equal justice in police activity means for all Americans. Instead of preaching about the evils of the market economy, oppressive institutions, or racial hatred, references to a well-regulated capitalism and pragmatic reforms that benefit everyone may stand a far greater chance of support. Polling of working-class voters in the Midwest, for example, has shown widespread backing for policies such as expanded Medicare, pre-K public schooling, a higher minimum wage, federal jobs programs, and taxes on the rich. Political journalist E.J. Dionne has advanced such an agenda. In Code Red, How Progressives and Moderates Can Unite to Save Our Country, published in 2020. Dionne advocates what he calls visionary gradualism, a strategic approach to establishing common ground between social justice activists and centrists. The goal would be the restoration of democratic values and the healing of social and economic wounds. To achieve this, however, Dionne warns that progressives must abandon unseemly moralism, understand the law of unintended consequences, and reject a belief in any single way forward. To this, I would add that efforts by small groups of exhibitionists who vent their rage on society with acts of violence and vandalism in the name of social justice must be denounced in no uncertain terms and in rapid fashion. Recent developments offer prospects of cutting into the cycle of fear that was intensified by 9/11. One includes mild congressional steps toward gun safety reform. Another emerged when Kansas voters defeated a state ballot initiative constitutionalizing bans on abortion by picturing the measure as an example of government overreach violating personal privacy. In another instance, parents and humanist allies in some communities are cooperating to preserve public school curricula applicable to a multicultural democracy. Still another has materialized in the recent congressional package, ensuring lower health and prescription drug costs and assistance in enabling homeowners and consumers to combat climate change. These may be incremental steps dealing with challenging problems, but with most of the Republican Party deferring to a single figure whose loyalists seek to impose an extremist agenda most voters reject, the ultimate test of democracy and pursuit of the common good will likely have to be decided in forthcoming elections. It may still be possible to replace reflexive panic attacks with a broad-based politics that allows a majority of Americans to move beyond individual grievances and a sense of victimhood while encouraging a rational engagement with the world and its problems. Nevertheless, time may be running out. Thank you so much for allowing me to share these thoughts with you. And I just wanted to let you know that I've created a reading list of some of the works that I have drawn from for this talk, and they're on the table in the back that you could pick them up after the session. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Horowitz, for a thorough and detailed walk down the path of modern history and some thoughts on how America can come together on both sides. Thank you for your presentation this morning. I guess I'll start with the first question. I see one of the major problems that we're dealing with in America right now is that we really live in two news ecosystems. And I almost feel like we could come together as a country and agree on facts when there were fewer news sources. What are your ideas on how we deal with this issue?
That is a problem, and many people have pointed to it. And I don't pretend to have original responses to it. But I generally think that in terms of encouraging rational debate, those who consider themselves, excuse me, those who consider themselves to be progressive and social justice activists have to be calm, particularly when relating to the extremist wings that are associated with the Trump movement, which may be 10 to 15% of the entire American population when you really break down the numbers. And simply say to them, look, we're a big country. You may have your views and your fantasies and your conspiracies, but you're not going to impose them on the majority of the American people. And so you're not that important. You're not going to dictate the nature of our society. Your ideas are foolish. A lot of them are based on ignorance. You have a right to have them as long as they're not used to hurt people. But there's no reason that the rest of us have to take them seriously. It's kind of a containment strategy. What George Kennan described in his response to Soviet expansionism in the late 1940s, he called the Soviet Union a toy automobile out of control. And he said the answer is not necessarily military response, but just a containment, saying, no, you're not going beyond here.
Thank you. Our next question comes from the president of HGP, live from the friendly house, Mr. Dave DiNucci.
Thank you very much. So one thing I heard in your talk was that you kind of drew a line from 9/11 and things prior to 9/11 to where we are now. And you gave that as a reason that the right is going for a very emotional approach to things, trying to put a bad guy out there that people can focus on more than producing constructive policies, etc. So that's really interesting. So the question is, can we do anything to pull these parts back together? And specifically, I guess it's specifically, the when 9/11 happened, as you mentioned, I mean, we created this Department of Homeland Security. That's the first time I'd ever heard homeland US referred to as the homeland. Maybe other people did. I equated that with stuff I'd heard from Nazi Germany and stuff like that. And I still hate the name. Is there any chance of maybe at least changing the name or somehow softening some of that rhetoric it seems to have created?
Well, as someone who studies American popular culture, I do have to remind you that Irving Berlin wrote "America, My Home, Sweet Home," which, God bless America, which would be a pretty good national anthem. However one defines God.
Yes, I don't mind the name of home, but homeland for some reason as a word.
Well, I don't know. I think it's relatively harmless. I think one of the points I was trying to make, and I really edited this down in terms of the time I had. In terms of military action overseas, and in terms of precautions that are done at home, most Americans will abide by them if they feel it makes them safer. And this is a problem that progressives have, because progressives have a sort of an ideal about individual freedoms and civil liberties and the consequences of these measures. But you have to take people where they are. And certainly in the post 9/11, immediate post 9/11 atmosphere, it was the Democrats who created it. And they were saying, look, let's stop all this bellicose, posturing. Let's make sure that we're able to anticipate attacks on our nation, with a domestic security branch. And so that was the idea of it, And if I remember, I thought that the Bush administration initially resisted the creation of a Homeland Security Act. I believe, I'm not 100% sure of that, but that's what my memory is, because there's another government bureaucracy, As to where we go to fix it, to bring this together, my thesis is that the destiny is with the 40% of Americans who are not particularly political or are independent, many of them suburbanites, many of them women suburbanites, who can be reached in terms of preserving a decent society that, particularly for families in the suburbs, can be part of what they use to bring up their children. There's all kinds of considerations there. So that 40% of sort of independents and non-affiliated, both the conservative and right-wing movements, no more than 30% of the electorate, and probably less. And progressives, the same thing. So there's the two sides. It leaves about 40% in the middle. And I call them transactional. They're there for the bidding, but you have to phrase and frame your proposals in terms that make sense to those people. Now, I think Congress did a great job with the last compromise legislation that was passed, the so-called fighting inflation. They did exactly what people like E.J. Dionne are recommending. And I put a lot of stock in his writing. I think he's one of the great journalists of our time, and I put him on that list.
Let's go to our Zoom audience and Al Christians with a question.
Yes, I recently read an article, I believe it was by Nassim Taleb, the relatively popular author, that said 3% can get their way if they're vocal enough. An example that he mentioned, I think, is what we have at the Friendly House where you are right now, is that peanuts are not allowed because 3% of the people at least are afraid of them.
Well, they're allergic.
They're allergic, but they have a very strong motivation to stay away from peanuts, and the rest of the group was willing to go along with that. when Trump got elected, I read this book of This Is an Uprising, which said that 3 to 5% of people could overturn any government. You mentioned 10 to 15% of these radical conservatives towards the end of your talk, and it seems to me that that's way more than what they need. There's a military rule that the attacker has a very strong advantage in any kind of a violent situation. What in the world are we going to do when there's so many of them? It's not like there's so few of them. It's so many compared to what they need.
I was watching one of my favorite cable anchors, Lawrence O'Donnell, a couple of weeks ago, after the Justice Department search for documents at Mar-a-Lago, and certain voices on the internet said that MAGA Nation's going to rise up and be out on the streets. And except for a couple of wannabes, nothing happened. O'Donnell mocked them. He said there were some 70 million Americans who voted for Donald Trump. They're not going to go out in the streets for this guy and risk their lives and, bring weapons and overthrow the government. They're just not that into it. I think I have a minority view here, and I don't want you to lose faith in me. I think a lot of the folks who showed up at the Capitol on January 6th, basically posers. They were doing what my friends, and to a certain extent I was doing during the Vietnam War period, of playing revolutionary. And they remind me so much of people I knew back in the late 60s and early 70s, talking about the corruption of the FBI, talking about American imperialism, talking about the system, and we're going to be overthrown, and when righteous people get together and when the people organize. It don't work that way. My view of Americans is why I have never believed this country would ever turn fascist, is that Americans believe in shopping. And, their video games and online accessories. Most people just are not political. Most people are not political. I mean, I come from a very political family. I'm a very political person. Well, I don't think it's unreasonable to expect people to want to have a nice family life, to have, a job that pays them well, to have medical insurance, and have some safety nets for if things don't go well, but not be particularly interested in ideology. Not be particularly interested in ideology. There are minorities of Americans who are totally immersed, in ideological and cultural fixations. The one thing that I remember about some of the extremist militias is this group of people in Michigan who had a plot to kidnap the governor of the state and maybe assassinate her. You know what they were upset about? They couldn't go to their gyms or their favorite bars during the COVID restriction. How pathetic. What idiots. I'm sorry. And that sort of stuck with me, a friend of mine lives down in Burbank, and there was a very popular bar that refused to be closed down during the COVID restrictions. And finally, the state closed it down, and there were demonstrations of our rights, My friend went and picketed them, and the police had to protect my friend, But a lot of the COVID restrictions, fueled this extremist right-wing obsession with our individual rights and the conspiracy theories related, to inoculations and masking and so forth. I just don't think they're much of a threat. Problem is always wannabes. There's always some emotionally disturbed individual who picks up stuff on the internet, just like with Al-Qaeda, and acts on it. And I don't know how you prevent that. But as an organized movement, I don't think there's any power there. Besides, a lot of these people have been imprisoned from the January 6th event, certainly a lot of the leaders. And I think the Biden administration has been pretty calm, and the Justice Department pretty calm in prosecuting these people, holding them accountable. So maybe 2-3% of the population of Portland can insist that there can't be peanuts here at Friendly House. But when it gets to larger issues, I'm not sure that small minorities like that. This is a pluralist society. It's a huge country of immensely different people, most of whom like shopping, of course.
Yeah, just a quick comment on Al's point. I actually think there's something beautiful in America, and maybe it can be a point of coalescing around bigger issues. And as someone who has someone with a peanut allergy in their lives, I mean, it's very serious. It's deadly. So to me, it's beautiful to have a large group make small sacrifice for the well-being of a few when it's a minor sacrifice compared to life and death issues. But others may disagree about that. We'll go to the Friendly House and Joyce with a question.
Thank you, Dr. Horowitz. Our humanist book group recently read Under the Banner of Heaven about the Mormons and their growth in the country, their rapid growth in the country, 1830s. And one of the points that was made in the book is that they thrived on persecution. The more they were persecuted, the faster they grew. And so I wonder if in a way that reinforces your point that if we on the left are more strident and more loud and more mocking, if that doesn't help build the right wing. And I don't know if this is an actual offshoot of that question or not, but does Trump have any chance to be elected again? Thank you.
To answer the second question, he may be the nominee of his party. We don't know about that, but I see no chance that he has of being elected again. I actually went through, I'm a political obsesso. I had a little time yesterday afternoon. I went through the redrawn electoral college map for 20, after the reapportionment. And I found, again, the best route to the Democrats winning in 2024, holding Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, and taking one of Arizona, Georgia, or Nevada, one of those three, if they hold. And this includes the reapportionment, of electoral college delegates. The Democrats have lost some. So that's pretty good. Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, which have been the arbiters of the last two previous presidential elections, and Nevada, and that would do it, or Georgia, or Arizona.
I'll ask a follow-up question to what you said earlier. One of your theses is that we need to bring the 40% of people who aren't particularly political into the process to help shape a more constructive America. And my question is, which organizations or potentially which organizations are doing the best job of reaching that 40%?
There are some, and their names are not going to come to my name right now, but I've seen some organizations, the Center Way and so forth, the Third Way. There are several Republicans, as you know, who have played quite vociferously, said that I'm a Republican, but the survival of democracy depends on a voting Democrat. But we all know Liz Cheney, is the foremost, but there's several. What's that? Yeah, right. A former Republican, yes. I think there are Democratic centrists, in Congress. And they get nervous sometimes, about the influence of the progressives. for some good reason. Progressives have, I think, a poor way of framing their goals, which are good goals, but poorly framed and frighten people sometimes, like Medicare for all and so forth. It's a great thought, but it's frightening to people. What happens to my private insurance that I have now and so forth? So I think that, I get all this campaign literature from Democrats, both online and in my mailbox. And they're all talking about courting independents, moderate Republicans, and Democrats. This doesn't always work. But I think there are forces in the Democratic Party that realize the importance of coalitions, somewhere I have here in my notes, Bill Scher, a writer with Politico a few years ago, coalitions win elections. A very basic principle. We have progressives who talk about energizing the base, and getting young people and people of color and so forth, and women out to vote. But that doesn't produce as fruitful a response as some might like. You need to do that, but you also need to court the middle. And I think Dion is right. It has to be a coalition of centrists and progressives. And if things are framed properly, it seems to me there's no way that that cannot be accomplished.
Let's go back to the Zoom link of the Christians for a question from Helen.
Hi, so much enjoyed your presentation and your comment about that the current Trump mega folks are reminding you a bit about the your youth, and it has mine too. Sometimes I was went to college in the late '60s, and remember, trying to, student strikes and stopping the war in Vietnam, and we're going to make a better society, and they ended up, listening to a lot of people with bullhorns, and I also remember that they shut down all the colleges, sent us home to our parents, and it was over. It was over. And these same people just stopped, our generation built more prisons than we've built universities like our parents did. So my comment is, my goodness, I forgot my question, but what do you think about this, that it'll just kind of fizzle out over time, that these mega voters will fizzle out just like the students for nonviolence have fizzled out over the years?
There's always been a place in American political life for conspiratorial minorities.
Yeah.
So they will never completely go away.
Mm-hmm.
There will always be a place. First of all, it's a big business. Online commentators, harvest email addresses, and that helps their podcasts, and they get more advertising for them. It's a whole network, built in there. And, with free speech measures, you can't throw them off the internet. There's always ways of their being there. But I think the future has to be with Americans who want a decent life and are not ideologically driven, and would like to save democracy. And democracy is more than an abstraction. It means that you have at least some say, and as faulty as our democratic electoral system is, which is a whole other issue, it gives you some say. Your vote is still your vote. And that determines the kind of circumstances in which you raise your family, in which you live, in which you work, in terms of the environment in which you live. So the abortion issue, obviously, has created an existential issue for a large number of voters who are not just women voters, that may tilt these midterm elections may allow the Democrats to hold the House of Representatives, which no one was anticipating 6 months ago, and which is still a tough kind of challenge to face. But things always change, you know, so that what a phenomenon emerges, it doesn't mean that it will always stay in that form. Now, you might argue that when a group gets smaller and smaller, it may get more extreme. And my view of the MAGA people and the militia people is that their manifestations of rage on January 6th and elsewhere are not signs of their power, but signs of their impotence. And I know that from having been an anti-war activist during the Vietnam War. The more desperate our situation seemed, the more angry and militant we got, which is stupid, and self-defeating. It's a trap that you create yourself.
Let's stay in the Zoom audience for our next question from Susan Pierce.
And you've confirmed my suspicion that Trump isn't really re-electable, regardless of how much he'd like to be. But I have two concerns, and I'm just wondering if I am right to be concerned. I'm very concerned, and I think you touched on this, about the various laws that restrict voting to groups of a variety of groups that are developing in several states. And another thing that concerns me is, whereas Trump is he's charismatic, but in many ways is a bumbling idiot. Ron DeSantis shares many of his ideologies and is focused and smart, and he scares me. Your response to that?
Fair enough. I think that Donald Trump is the only president elected in American history that did not present a cheerful demeanor to the public. Remember, Ronald Reagan's genius, no matter what you may think of his policies and his prejudices, he was always cheerful about it. When he was mocking the Democrats and the liberals, it was with a smile. He was such an affable person. And in a certain way, despite his abysmal ignorance, he was a humble person. I don't think DeSantis has the personality. I've seen some assertions, and I don't know if these are true because they may have come in a Democratic campaign circular, that independents in Florida are having a hard time with DeSantis. He's too disruptive. And he's not putting away Charlie Crist in the polling. 4 or 5%, 3%. DeSantis will probably win the governorship again, but it's not a slam dunk. And I've seen polling that pits him against Biden in a national election in 24, and he doesn't really come out very well. I just don't think he has the personality.
That's interesting.
I want to make sure we get to one last question from the Friendly House, someone who does so much for our production crew, as well as our MCs, Mr. Jeff Strang.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Horowitz, for your nice, broad view of things. And it reminds me of Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind, on moral foundations of conservatives and liberals. And it's interesting to me, the kind of moral judo that needs to be practiced with like playing, for example, the right to privacy in the abortion argument versus the belief of some people that birth starts with conception. Do you have any comments about that?
Well, I think you said it all. I agree with what you said. I guess my last word is, for people desperately like myself looking for some fix for all of this, is not to get spooked. by, I was a friend of William Appleman Williams, the radical history professor at Oregon State for many years. And his slogan was, "Don't let the bastards get you down." But I really believe that, you know. You've got to maintain your values, your equilibrium, your self-confidence, and calmness. I mean, I scream at the television as much as probably most of you, but publicly, I try to maintain a certain equilibrium. So I didn't want to give an account of the legacy of 9/11 and leave you in the lurch, you know, without some sort of hopeful signs for how we can, you know, direct the pathologies that have emerged since that event, and that also have roots in things that happened before that event. But anyhow, I really appreciate, as I said, your attention and your opportunity to, I love sharing my thoughts with people because it stimulates my brain. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Horowitz. An excellent presentation this morning.